Welcome to this Tenant Cloud webinar. If you can hear the sound of my voice, if you can go ahead and click on the emojis on the bottom of the screen and just let me know that you can hear me, that would be fantastic. Awesome. Lots of emojis. Great. That means everybody can hear me, hopefully. So, appreciate you attending this webinar on tenant screenings. I hope that this webinar is going to be packed full of information that is going to help you to select better tenants, to develop better rental criteria, and to help you avoid any potential exposure to unnecessary risks in the screening process. And definitely appreciate you taking the time to join this presentation. I do believe we have something like 30 or 45 minutes set aside for this presentation. If you are not able to stay for that entire time, of course, we would love to have you stay the entire time, but I understand if you cannot. We will post this webinar on our Tenant Cloud YouTube channel probably sometime between today and tomorrow, maybe Monday or Tuesday at the latest. So if you do need to watch this at a later time, you are certainly welcome to do so on our Tenant Cloud YouTube channel. At the end of this presentation, we are going to answer your questions live. There is a Q&A button, and there is also a chat thread that some of you, I think, are already starting to chat in there. So go ahead and feel free to ask any questions using the Q&A or the chat thread. It would make things a lot easier if you use the Q&A for questions, just so that they don't get lost in the chat thread, assuming other people are chiming in and saying and just having general conversations in there. The Q&A button would be the preferred place to ask questions if you can. And then at the end of the presentation, we will also have a short poll. It'll be like 2 or 3 questions. If you would do us a huge favor and answer some of those questions, it just helps us gauge how valuable the information that we shared was and the overall success of the webinar in terms of was it valuable to you to attend and to get this information. And of course, we always love to get your feedback on other topics that you would like to hear us discuss in the future for future webinars such as this one. So again, thanks for joining, and we're going to jump right in here to the presentation. I am going to share my screen here because the last time I shared the file through this platform, some people couldn't see it for some reason. So I'm going to share the whole screen here. Just let me know if you can see my screen. It's probably going to look like a mirror or a never-ending tunnel to you. Awesome. Looks like everybody can see it. Fantastic. So I'm going to share this presentation. Can everybody see this webinar presentation? If you can just hit those emojis again. Awesome. Y'all are amazing. All right. So this tenant screening presentation is about not just no, you cannot ask that question and more helpful insights, but it's going to really be a deep dive into the tenant screening process. And I think that we're probably going to cover some things that some of you may not be aware of. And then at the end of the presentation, I'm going to give you what I would call kind of a golden ticket to answer as much of the problems that you may currently be experiencing in your process. And of course, along the way throughout the presentation, there's going to be lots of helpful information that is probably going to help you with some of those pain points as well. Just to give you a brief introduction of who I am, my name is Chris, and of course, I am your host for today's webinar. And to give you a little background, I've been in the property management industry for over a decade. I've managed everything from single family homes to duplexes, fourplexes, all the way up to apartment communities the size of small rural towns. And I've managed a portfolio of well over 1,500 units and several hundred renovations, lease ups, and the like. So, been in the property management industry for over a decade, and now I am, of course, on the software side of the industry. And so that gives some more unique insights across the board from not just the place and the city and the type of rentals that I've managed, but across the spectrum of the rental industry, and really having an even better understanding of what's going on across the industry as a whole, which is a pretty interesting place to see. So, if you're like me, though, you've probably discovered that despite your experience in the industry, you probably realize how little you actually know. And it's good to get refreshers on the things that you do know, in case you've become rusty or you've forgotten something essential along the way. And so, if you're like me, you're always looking for updated information, webinars such as this one, and hopefully you're going to glean a lot of that helpful information from today's presentation. I always like to say, starting out these webinars, that there is nothing about property management that is rocket science. It's pretty simple, but if you were to ask me which two aspects or which aspect of property management was the most difficult to navigate, and the most difficult to get right, I would say that it's probably tenant screening is a solid first, and the eviction process is probably a solid second. And the reason that I say those two things are probably the most difficult aspects of property management to get right is because they are the most heavily governed under federal, state, and even local laws. And failure to familiarize yourself with the network of laws that govern those two parts of property management can cause missteps that get you in extremely hot water and create a level of exposure to legal risks that you simply don't want to have. Nobody wants to have. And so, the tenant screening side of things is going to really set the stage, set the foundation for what happens at your rental going forward, right? Because that's going to determine potentially whether you end up in an eviction process, which is, like I just said, probably to me at least, the second most difficult part of property management. And to avoid that from happening, you really need to nail down the tenant screening process and get it right. So, that being said, that is what this webinar aims to accomplish. There is a disclaimer we want to go over because we are dealing with laws and legal topics. And so I'm just going to read it real quick. Thanks for joining us today. Please note that the information provided in this webinar, including but not limited to insights on rental history checks, use of specific software like TazWorks and TenantCloud, and methodologies for tenant screening, is for general, informational, and educational purposes only. You can go ahead and read the rest here, but it's not intended to serve as legal, financial, or professional advice, and etc. By continuing to participate in this webinar, you acknowledge and agree to this disclaimer. The views and opinions expressed in this webinar are those of the presenter and do not reflect the official policy or positions of any software platform or tools mentioned. In today's presentation, we're going to be covering multiple things. The one thing we're going to be covering in depth is the critical role of rental history in tenant screening. But beyond that, we're going to cover a lot of other stuff. I'll show you here in the second slide shortly. The increasing scrutiny of rental screenings and how they're used to approve or deny rental applications. There are some stats here that I feel like would be helpful for you to understand leading into this presentation. Approximately 1 in 4 American adults, which is a shocking number, have a criminal record, anything from a misdemeanor arrest to a felony conviction, according to an estimate from the National Employment Law Project. 2022 Consumer Financial Protection Bureau report, uh, based on 17 tenant screening companies that are used nationally by landlords across the nation. These are some of the biggest tenant screening companies. They found that most tenant screener business models appear to rely on low cost automated retrieval of court records for criminal and eviction records without the more costly manual verification needed to ensure accuracy. If you have ever seen or even use a lot of the tenant screening products that are 10, 15, 20 bucks and their instantaneous results happens right away. A lot of those are what this is referring to. They're going based off of a national database that is automated, and it's a pre-purchased database that they are buying every so often, and it's not the most updated records. And it has actually caused a few different companies to be sued. It has caused property managers to find themselves in court due to making decisions based off of information that was inaccurate, incomplete, or even outdated. And so it is extremely important that you know what you are using. Not all screening products are created alike, and different screening products come with additional risks that you may not be aware of, as was discovered in this recent report on tenant screening products. A 2023 report from the National Consumer Law Center explains that the screening process is riddled with errors, and can't talk today, errors and bias that disproportionately harm Black and Latino Hispanic renters. And in the report, Digital Denials, How Abuse, Bias, and Lack of Transparency in Tenant Screening Harm Renters, there are a few interesting quotes which are going to be relevant to some of the information we're discussing. One is landlords frequently make leasing decisions based solely on these tenant screening scores and recommendations. And our research reveals that they are unlikely to hear disputes or to consider mitigating factors. There's absolutely no evidence that credit scores have value in predicting whether a renter will pay their rent. Credit scores are designed for one thing only. They are designed to predict whether a consumer will be late on a loan, from the National Consumer Law Center and a senior attorney there. Other things we're going to be diving into are how to collect comprehensive rental history information, establishing your rental application criteria, legal considerations, obtaining consent for background checks, exploring verification methods, automatic versus manual, and the significance of local courthouse data for accurate screenings. Extremely important. We'll also have a Q&A session. We'll look at automatic verification, the value of manual verification. If you aren't sure what that is, you'll want to stay tuned. Crafting practical questions for previous landlords, overcoming common challenges, leveraging technology, and key takeaways and strategies. So we have a lot of ground to cover, and I'm going to try to do it quickly and efficiently because we are already 11 minutes in and we are running out of time. So, a real life example, over the years, tenant screening companies have dug deeper into applicants' backgrounds. Many of the reports are being stripped of important details. In 2016, a Latino man named Mikhail, or I'm going to butcher his name, Mr. Arroyo, was denied a rental application to move into an apartment with his mother in Windham, Connecticut, after a tenant screening report picked up a low level shoplifting citation from 2 years before. They sued this company, the screening agency that provided the report, arguing that it violated the Fair Housing Act, the landmark 1968 law that protects renters from practices that have a disparate uh, negative impact on racial minorities, disabled people, and other protected groups. They argued that the screening didn't provide all the information CoreLogic had uncovered. It showed a criminal court action against Arroyo that said it was disqualifying, but it didn't say that the accusation was for a nonviolent theft or explain that the charges were eventually dropped. That's just a real life story. One another life story, which is more personal, is that kind of goes along with that is, and it's kind of what inspired this webinar, amongst other things, is I know somebody who recently, in the past 2 to 3 years, got into real estate, and they have become very successful very quickly. They are well now over 20 some units, 25 plus units, and they've launched a bunch of other businesses, photography businesses, all kinds of stuff. And they're a very successful individual. And they had posted something recently, and I had seen it posted, and it was basically how they go about approving rental applicants for their rental properties. And they discuss things like, I take a look at their car and how clean is their car, and I ask them questions to determine, like, do they like this property, and do they how do they value their property, and have they valued prior properties, and what condition did they leave other properties in that they've rented before, and all kinds of questions like that. And just getting a general, and essentially saying they just get a general overall sense of the individual, and that's how they go based off of approvals or denials. And so I quickly reached out to them and said, hey, I just want to let you know, you are an incredibly brilliant person. You've created all these businesses. You've clearly built a real estate portfolio that is highly successful, and I would love for you to stay that way. And so I'm going to give you some feedback, if you're open to it, on some of the cautions that you should be aware of when it comes to tenant screenings, because that is an extremely important process to be aware of. And based on this content that you put out, it sounds like you might not be familiar with that. And so, after I explained all of the intricacies of the rental screening process, this person was extremely grateful for the information. They were not aware of a lot of it. They did not realize that they were under the guidelines of the Fair Housing Act because they had X number of rental units. They weren't just renting out a duplex where they lived in one and rented out the other, or were just renting out a bedroom in their home. The typical things that are generally exceptions to the rule of the law when it comes to the Fair Credit Reporting Act and Fair Housing Act, etc. And so they immediately implemented a lot of changes, which is fantastic. It's important. And so that is just one of the many reasons that this caused this webinar to come about, along with some other things that we've seen, of course, in the system and introducing some new tools and the like. But it dawned on me that, okay, well, that is a large percentage of our user base, is a lot of people who are starting out in the rental industry, or they've grown a portfolio and they probably run other businesses, and they may not be aware of all of these important factors that play into the rental process, especially as it relates to tenant screening. So here are some key insights that we are going to cover as far as why rental history matters. And of course, the proper process of going through rental screenings. Number one, the reason that rental history matters is because it predicts future tenant behavior. Gives you an analysis of their previous behavior, and of course, it gives you a level of assessment of risk going forward if they were to rent from you and your rental property. Number two, it reveals eviction and payment history. It shows you the eviction records, including any filings that may have taken place, but maybe didn't go through completely. There wasn't a judgment at the end. And it gives you payment history patterns. And number three, it indicates how previous properties were treated, whether or not they took care of the rental property. Do they have charges from a prior landlord for damages to the rental that are maybe sitting on their credit report or something? Landlord references. Those are landlord references when somebody moves in and they apply for your rental and they put on the rental application their prior addresses. You should probably know if that's a rental or not. And if so, what's the contact information for the landlord? We'll get into that in a little bit. And then security deposit deductions. That'll also indicate how they treated the previous property. Did they take care of all of their bills, or did they not even get a security deposit return at all? Again, we'll get into that in a little bit. Collecting rental history on the application form. In order to properly screen a tenant, here's some core information that you need to make sure you're getting on the rental application. One, request current and previous addresses. That provides you with an accurate rental history assessment, which you can then compare against their credit score or their credit report, showing you their previous registered addresses. If there's something that doesn't line up, for example, maybe they neglected to put that there was a different property that they stayed at a year or 2 years ago that shows up on their tenant screening report that they didn't disclose on the application. That's probably a yellow flag that you want to dig a little deeper into. Mobility and rental patterns. It shows you how often they move. Are they moving every 6 months, every 4 months, or are they moving once a year, once every 2 years, once every 3 years? Those give you indications, not that you would make a decision based off of that because you probably shouldn't, but it would give you some indication of whether or not this tenant is likely to renew or not with you at your rental property. If they're jumping from property to property over the past 3 years, chances are they're probably not going to renew at your property. And that's just something you may want to tuck away in the back of your mind for your renewal process with that rental property. Number two, ask for landlord contact info for the last 2 to 3 years minimum. Most property management companies and landlords will tend to ask for 2 to 3 years of records. It's not uncommon for property management companies to ask for records prior to that, but definitely the last 2 to 3 years is a very standard minimum across the board. Local jurisdiction records and reaching out to prior landlords. Those are pieces of information that you're going to want to get as a part of the rental history screening. We'll again dig into this a little bit more here. One of the most important parts of the rental screening process is you must have a rental criteria guide. Rental criteria guide essentially details and gives transparency to why someone would be approved or declined. Without a rental criteria, you are largely depending on your own opinion, and you are depending on a spectrum of reasons why you may or may not approve somebody, or why you would decline somebody that may prove difficult to defend in court should you end up there arguing why you did or did not approve somebody, but you did or did not approve somebody else. And so a rental criteria provides that framework for making those decisions and provides the framework to protect you down the road should you find yourself at risk on the legal side of things. Some of the things you want to take into consideration for your criteria for creating it is your location, of course, your laws, demographics, and property type. For example, if maybe you have a rental property that is not exactly a class A property, maybe it's a class B or class C or something like that, then maybe you are not going to be able to command a 650 credit score, which we'll get to why you shouldn't do that in a minute to begin with. But let's just use that as an example. Or maybe you should not have other specific criteria set up as a part of your rental criteria because of the location of the rental property, or because you simply can't, because the laws in your city, state, or on the federal level do not allow for it. So, those are just some of the factors that play into creating your criteria for your rental property. Other things are scores and credit scores and evictions and income ratios and more. You need to take those into consideration. What are you going to require as an income ratio? It doesn't need to be 2 or 2.5 times their income or 3 times their income. The most common is typically, I believe, 2.5 to 3 times their rental income is what, or rental rate is what their income needs to be. And if you're going to make decisions based off of that, you need to make decisions based off of that across the board with all applicants, unless there is some other factor that comes into play. Maybe you have a balance where it says, well, if your income ratio doesn't meet 2.5, but it's over 2, then, but your credit score is 625 or 650 or 750 or whatever, then you can still be approved. Or maybe it's something even simpler. Maybe if your income ratio is only 2.5, but we need 3, your deposit is going to need to be equivalent to 1 or 2 months of rent, or it's going to be you have to show a bank account with $10,000 in it in savings or something like that. There are different ways you can look at it. And of course, it boils down to the laws in your area, but there are different ways that different property management companies set those criteria for things like income. At a lot of my rental properties over the years, it was not uncommon where if they did not meet the renter score that we were looking for, or maybe they had some other questionable thing come up on their credit or background check, we would allow them to still rent if they paid a X amount of security deposit to hedge against the risks that were presented in their tenant screening. But again, that needs to be disclosed. You also need to decide how far back to check. A lot of property management companies depends on what they're looking for, but criminal typically goes back 7 to 10 years. Credit, most credit stuff falls off in most states after about 7 years across the board. There are some states that some things stay on longer than others, but in general, the 7 to 10 year time frame is pretty average across the board. But again, you have to look at the laws and what you're allowed to do in your state and city because they've started to crack down on a lot of that stuff. Plus, you need to have reasonable expectations. Are you going to really be looking at somebody's rental history from 10 years ago if nothing shows up on their credit report about it? You probably wouldn't even be able to, because if it is 10 years old, in most states, like I just said, a lot of those records aren't even going to be present after 7 years anyway. And if they are present after 7 years, according to the Fair Credit Reporting Act, you technically can't even take action on something like that over 7 years because a lot of those things are no longer applicable and you can't use them um, based on that law, which we'll get into in a second. How history impacts decisions, late payments versus actual evictions. Does your rental applicant have a lot of late payments? Okay, well, then maybe you need to look at, have they ever actually been evicted? Or maybe they're just living paycheck to paycheck like so many Americans are. And maybe their rent comes in on the 10th of the month, or maybe they're on a fixed income and their fixed income check doesn't come in until the 7th or the 10th or the 15th or whatever. And so they're constantly behind, but they always pay. I've had many tenants like that over the years where they were on fixed income and their check didn't come in until the third or the fourth or whatever. And our grace period was only through the third or the fourth. And so they would consistently be late and they'd always have a late fee. And so it just depends on what's going on with that applicant. And so it's helpful to weigh what is an actual risk to you as the landlord and what your criteria is going to state and how you're going to approve or deny based on that information. Getting authorization to conduct a screening is, again, another incredibly important piece of this puzzle. You must have explicit authorization according to the FCRA, Fair Credit Reporting Act, and it must be written consent for screenings. Two, digital consents via platforms like TenantCloud, of course, simplify that step because we meet digital standards and electronic signature requirements according to the law, so that anything that relates to the screening process, they're signing off and allowing their screenings to be conducted. It streamlines the screening process and it automatically retains digital consent records and other important records that you are going to need should you ever be challenged on your ability to conduct screenings that you pulled on an applicant. Verification methods overview, automatic versus manual. So there are different ways that you can screen tenants, right? You can have the automatic ways, which is what everything has pretty much been moving towards over the past decade or so. But there are also manual ways that you can implement in your screening process that might be beneficial depending on your property or your location or the type of screening information that you really need. So, one is automatic entails online background checks that includes criminal and credit. There are instant and rapid screening services, but as we discussed at the start of this presentation, a lot of those are not as thorough, especially when it comes to local county based records and rural records from jurisdictions that may not have joined us in this century with digital record reporting, or maybe they're just slow to get information reported online. I live in such a county. In fact, I recently filed a homestead exemption, and it has been over 90 days, and it's still not information is still not online. So a lot of rural counties, they don't have a lot of manpower and resources to update stuff as quickly as they probably should, and some of them don't have digital records at all, and a lot of it is locally based. So it's important to keep that in mind when you are using cheaper rapid screening services that are operating off of databases that they've purchased maybe a month ago. Manual screening processes with actual humans involved combined with automated screenings often make for the most thorough screening processes. And we'll get into that in a second because that doesn't necessarily mean your human involvement, your personal involvement, or your manual processing of anything. There's something that we'll talk about shortly. That brings us to TazWorks and courthouse data. So, why local matters? TazWorks is a company that TenantCloud has integrated with, and they actually provide the human element to the screening process. What that means is that when TenantCloud does a screening and you select the local county screening reports as a part of your screening, what TazWorks then does is they check their database for any information as it relates to local counties that the person has ever lived in or lives in currently based on the county add-on that you select. And what then happens is if there is a ping on their database that says, yes, there is something in this county, but it can't be found online, they then actually go into a human aspect, a manual aspect of screening where they actually personally reach out to the court. And sometimes they even have um, clerks or processors that actually go physically to the court in some cases, in some of the more rural counties, to actually get the physical record on what came back as being a red flag or yellow flag or whatever in their system. And then that, of course, will get uploaded as part of the overall screening report that you would get through the Tenant Cloud platform through our integration with TazWorks. It is an incredibly powerful tool, and it is an extremely important tool. I am aware of several scenarios where um, one was actually a very serious, heinous crime. It wasn't something that was done through Tenant Cloud. It was a screening. It was through is another property manager that I know. They use a different screening product, and it did not pull up a local record of a criminal filing against someone who had committed a very heinous crime. And because they did not know that, they had actually approved this applicant because nothing else was on the record on the national database screening about this thing. And they later on discovered this issue through a series of events. And it became painfully clear to them that the screening products that they were using were not efficient enough. And so a large part of that is because the product that they were using is, as we've discussed, was not pulling live up to the moment information on the local county level for counties that are more rural and aren't reporting stuff as quickly as others through online databases. So, courthouse data is you cannot compare it to anything else. It is unparalleled accuracy, and it is important to have local courthouse and county data in reports, especially for background screenings. National databases can miss or even report inaccurate local records. Um, there are also scenarios on the flip side where a national database reports convictions that may have been expunged or even obsolete non conviction records. There have been multiple screening companies that have been sued. You can find information online about it where this scenario played out, just like the one that I shared with you at the beginning of this presentation, where the National Screening Database did not actually disclose all of the information that was required for the landlord to make a informed decision. And so that again is a level of legal exposure and risk that is unnecessary because you can use tools that actually do provide comprehensive background and credit screening data. Background screeners also can only report non conviction records for 7 years. Non conviction records include arrests, criminal complaints, warrants, indictments, parole, probation, and other various possible dispositions besides convictions. The 7 year period begins from the date of the arrest. You can see more information about that under the Fair Credit Reporting Act, Section 5.2.3.8.3, if you are interested in looking into that more, which hopefully you are, because again, that is the purpose of this webinar, is to really give you a deep dive into the tenant screening process to help you personally try to reduce your risk and exposure to risk. The automatic side of things. To do an efficient screening process, you want to, of course, one, look at rental history reports, right? You also want to do credit checks for tenants, but you have to realize that credit checks for tenants are not the same as FICO scores. FICO scores and Vantage scores are two different types of scoring models. And then even within those, they have Vantage 3.0, FICO 8.0, etc. And the different models are actually for different reasons, and they're used by different industries for those different reasons. Most of those reasons are related to loans, right? They're related to mortgages, they are related to personal loans, to credit cards, etc. And those scoring models, their algorithms are not applicable to renters and generally are not a good indicator of their likelihood of being a good tenant. That's simply not what they're designed for. Instead, what you need to look for is you need to look for a tool that is actually designed for the purpose of tenant screening, which is what Tenant Cloud uses. And there's other products out there here and there that do similar things. But the Tenant Cloud screening product actually looks at it from a renter score. In fact, we provide a renter score as part of the screening process. And we also provide the credit reports as part of the process because you want to actually be able to see the details on the credit report, not just a score that tells you, yeah, this person is likely to pay back this loan of this amount because of their income and their payment history and so on. Those are not good factors for determining whether or not they're going to be a good tenant, a quality tenant that's going to pay rent on time, et cetera, and not end up in eviction court. And so it's important to make that distinction. In fact, I was just chatting with some people shortly before this webinar about this very topic. They were discussing rental scores and FICO scores and Vantage scores, and we were just chatting about that. It's a very important distinction to make. If you do use credit scores and you set a credit score and say, well, credit score, you have a 615, 617 credit score, whatever, and so I can't approve you. Well, going forward, as a part of your rental criteria, chances are you're probably going to need to decline anybody else who has that same credit score because you've set that standard for your rental application process. So it's something to take into consideration. What score are you using if you're using a score in your rental criteria? Searching court records, national database. Yes, TenantCloud does that. We do it through our screening product, but we also offer the ability to do local county searches to deep dive to make sure that anything that was potentially missed in the national database is hopefully found and discovered through the local county search. And you have to be aware that when you use a more thorough screening product, sometimes it's just not going to be instant, especially when you're doing a local county search. Because what might happen is the local county search, like I explained a little bit ago, it might ping that, hey, something came up in this county, but we don't have the specifics. We're going to need to do a deeper dive and actually reach out to the courthouse, the county, whatever, to get this information. And so that could take a day or two or more because you're talking about a very manual process where you have to put in a request to the county to pull the records to get the specific details, or to even get an update on the status of maybe a case that came up in the national database, but it's incomplete because it doesn't match what's going on the local county level as of that date. So you need to be aware as a property manager and a landlord that not to be giving applicants a timeline saying, yeah, we'll approve it or decline it in 24 hours. It might not be in 24 hours. It could be a little while to get a complete screening result. But that additional wait time is generally nowhere near as painful as what the pain you could experience down the road, because an extra 2, 3, even 5 days of waiting could help you avoid a 3, 4, 5-month battle, maybe even longer, to try to get somebody out of a rental who shouldn't have been approved in the first place. And so it's important to make sure that you're really taking the time to do your screenings properly, even if that means extending the process out a little bit. Income verification insights. This model analyzes the applicant's self reported income that they put on the application. So when you ask them and you say, well, I need you to have 2.5 or 3 times the amount of rent as your income, it takes that information that they report on the application saying, yeah, I make $3,000 a month or 5 or 10 or whatever. And it compares that from data from the credit report, including an analysis of how much they pay towards balances, the amount of money they spend, the types of balances they carry, and other factors related to the algorithm that the income insights tool uses. And if you have been in the property management industry for any period of time, you would probably know that this is actually becoming a huge problem in the rental industry as the cost of living continues to increase and skyrocket. People have gradually gravitated towards falsifying rental or falsifying income documents, even so much as W-2s and pay stubs. In fact, if you go on a Facebook Marketplace or Craigslist or other places online, you can actually find people actually selling services to help people falsify income documents. So if you aren't aware that that's a problem, you are aware now. And that's why tools such as Income Insights have been incorporated into TenantCloud, because our job is to help you manage your rental properties better and more efficiently, and to not end up in a situation where you've approved somebody that maybe you didn't catch on their pay stub or on the W-2 that this is not right. This is inaccurate. This person doesn't actually make this amount of money. So that is another incredibly powerful tool to be incorporated into your automatic verification of your screenings. Which brings us to manual verification tactics. There are manual verification tactics that you can use in the rental screening process. Again, I'm going to speed this up a little bit because we are at 10:39. So again, I appreciate everybody who has stuck with me through this point in the presentation. We're going to try to fly through here through the rest of this presentation so we can get to your questions. Manual verification tactics include interviewing past landlords, conducting reference checks. You should be asking for reference checks on your applications. Now, is anybody going to provide you contact information for somebody who's probably not going to or somebody who's going to give you bad information? Probably not. But you can still reach out to those references to A, make sure they're real, and two, still get a sense of feedback from them if that's part of your rental screening process and your rental criteria. Double check and calculate applicants' pay stubs. We just touched on this. You need to look very, very closely at pay stubs, W 2s, whatever uh, your income verification requirements are and documentation is. You need to pay very close attention. You actually need to calculate it with a calculator. You need to sit down and actually punch in the numbers to make sure that they make sense, because common errors on the ones that are manufactured by people and falsified, they're usually riddled with mathematical errors. They don't typically make a whole lot of sense, but they'll usually pass the check if you just kind of glance at it and don't really look at the numbers. So crunch the numbers. Or again, use the income insights to also kind of help you gauge whether or not the income documentation provided is accurate or not. When you do reach out to previous landlords, there are some important questions to consider: fact versus opinion based questions. A lot of property management companies and landlords will not answer opinion based questions. What are opinion based questions? Those are questions like, would you rent to this person again? Did this person treat your property nicely? Did they take care of it? Those are opinion based questions. They cannot typically be backed up by any hard, solid data, because that might have been just a bad experience they had with that person, and it's not based off of any factual data that's coming up in any current screening reports that you might have pulled in the past day or two. So questions that you should consider if you are reaching out to previous landlords using any manual methods such as fax or phone or whatever, is: what was their lease start and end date? What was the lease rent amount that they paid? What was the number of late payments? Did they have any returned or failed payments? Property care and compliance. Instead of saying, did they take care of the property, simply ask, were there any security deposit deductions upon move out? Renewal and overall tenancy feedback. What was the length of their tenancy? Did they stay for the full lease? Did they renew, etc.? Um, you also have to be aware that when you do manual methods of reaching out to previous landlords, that there are some unethical landlords that will simply respond with a glowing review, tell you no late rent payments. Yeah, they fulfilled their lease. Yep, yep, yep. Everything's good, because they want to get rid of a problem tenant. So not necessarily the best thing to rely upon, but it still helps you to line up whether or not this information is consistent with the information that your applicant provided on their application. That's why you should ask for information. How long were you a resident there? What was your lease start date? What was your lease end date? What rent amount were you paying? Etc. And that will help you gauge whether or not the records are lining up. So again, avoid opinion-based questions. There have actually also been lawsuits about this, which is why a lot of property management companies have stopped that entirely. They will only answer factual questions on previous landlord questions coming from you or any other place that they're receiving these requests from. In fact, some property management companies won't reply to them at all, which leads us to overcoming verification challenges. Problem solving. If you are finding landlords are unreachable, you should try them via email, phone, mail, and if they have fax, still try to reach out via fax, and maybe reach out at different times of the day. Maybe they don't come into the office, or maybe they don't even start working until 11 or 12 or 1 or whatever. To reach out at different times of the day. And identifying fake references. It's not uncommon, just like falsified income documentation, for people to put fake references and fake landlord information. So they might put landlord so and so at this property, but it might be a brother or a sister or a friend or somebody else. And so things like vague responses from the contact that you reach out to. Maybe they can't recall the lease start date, or maybe they're having trouble recalling other information, or inconsistencies they provide that don't match the application. This comes back to these core questions here from your rental application. Or they're overly eager to provide a glowing view, which goes back to these landlords. And property ownership name online doesn't match the contact's name. In a lot of counties now, you can actually look up in their database, you can look up the county and see, does the name that this person put for their landlord actually match the owner of the property according to official county records? If not, that might be a yellow flag. Of course, Tenant Cloud simplifies this entire process. This is a Tenant Cloud webinar after all. So we help you streamline it. And that's why all of these things we've discussed, it's important to use a property management software system that's designed to make this job easier, because there are so many essential elements to the process and there are so many risks along the way that you are exposed to. It's important to establish a process, stick to that process, and try to reduce your exposure to those risks. And so we do that through efficiency, through automation. We try to automate as much of the process as possible. We do the nationwide screening, but we also do the local screenings. We also do the income insights. We also streamline it from start to finish. You can list and advertise on Tenant Cloud. You can schedule and show. You can do application screenings. We have the CMS, customer management relationship tool, to manage when inquiries are coming in, to determine whether or not this person is interested. And you can schedule tours and put it on your calendar and the like. You can do the approval and the leasing process. You can do the move out and the final statements, because when they move out, you need to provide a final statement, right? Within, typically most states, it's within 30 days. Some it's shorter. Some states, I believe, I was just researching Delaware the other day, I think they have like a 20-day time frame in which you have to get a final account statement out when a tenant moves out. Reporting and record keeping, it's all automated in the Tenant Cloud system. And whatever isn't automated that you're doing outside of the Tenant Cloud system, you can import and upload that documentation and put in notes and timelines and all the like, to make sure that everything is kept in one place. And so it streamlines that entire process. So here are some key takeaways. One is, hopefully you understand the importance of thorough tenant screening. I'm sure you already knew that coming into this webinar, but hopefully the information I've been sharing throughout this presentation has really done a deep dive into why, and more details as to why the tenant screening process is so important and the risks involved in it. So risk mitigation, you want to protect yourself against potential property damage, potential unpaid rent, legal issues, lengthy evictions. All of that information should be coming through in a lot of these screenings. And then your manual involvement of reaching out to previous landlords and reaching out to references, and then the local screening process happening. And then, of course, blending technology and direct communication. So efficiency versus thoroughness. Yes, we all want things to happen quickly. We live in a society and a culture where instantaneous is what we like. We like things that happen quickly. But unfortunately, there are still some things that are worth waiting for, that are not as quick as we might like, especially when it comes to those local county searches. And a few extra days versus months of pain and thousands in damages, it's well worth it. Automatic versus manual, we've discussed. Sometimes a combination of both works best, depending on your rental and, of course, the laws in your area. Next steps for you as a property manager and a landlord. If you have not done these already, it is important to understand federal and regional laws and ordinances. Things like, on the federal level, the Fair Housing Act, the Fair Credit Reporting Act, and the like. There are other ones that are on state levels that you need to be familiar with. We don't have time to go through them. We are starting to write about some of those things on the Tenant Cloud blog. So if you haven't checked that lately, we do have a laws section which kind of expands on this a little bit, and we're starting to dig deeper into the state level stuff. But it's essential for you as a property manager or even a small landlord. It does not matter if you have 5, 7, 10 units. It does not matter. A lot of these things are applicable to you. 2, create listings and set proper expectations. If you're getting a lot of unqualified leads or people that are wasting your time with your rental, it means that maybe your listings are not as clear and transparent as they need to be. If you're getting a lot of people who don't meet the rental income, for example, or they have pets, but you don't allow pets at your property, those are things that you might want to be disclosing as part of your listing so that you can cut down on the number of unqualified prospects that are taking up your time. Pre-screen the applicants if necessary. If you need to put questions to pre-screen your applicants, to ask them questions like, have you ever had an eviction in the past 3 years, if that's part of your rental criteria guide? And they put that on there, then yes, I had an eviction 2.5 years ago or 3 years ago. Okay, well, you know that that person is not qualified according to your criteria. Put scheduling and touring on autopilot. In Tenant Cloud, you can do all of these things. You can pre-screen applicants with pre-screening questions. You can put your scheduling and touring on autopilot or at least partial autopilot. When people inquire about your listing, they can request a schedule a tour with you. You can put that on your calendar. And that's all on the customer relationship management tool, the CRM in Tenant Cloud, where you can track a lot of that stuff. And we have some exciting news coming down the pipeline at some point in this year. We have a new partnership where you're going to be able to put the scheduling and touring on autopilot even more, where you even potentially remove yourself entirely from the scenario, or at least mostly. It's a pretty cool integration that we are currently working on. So stay tuned for that. Create a formal application criteria and stick to it. That's important. Streamline the application process and automate your screenings as much as possible, unless, of course, you need to incorporate something manual into the process. So, with all that being said, we're going to conclude the presentation portion, and we are going to do a Q&A and answer your questions. All right. I kind of did okay with that. It's 10:50, so it looks like I went 5 minutes over. Not too bad compared to some previous webinars we've had. All right, so let's go ahead and review some of these questions that we have had come through. Let's see. Can you discuss student housing screening cosigners with parents and other unique elements? So on Tenant Cloud, you can certainly do that. Depending on, again, I'll just to frame kind of my answers to a lot of these. Again, it's going to be based on local legal restrictions, state restrictions, et cetera, on what you can or cannot do. But in terms of Tenant Cloud, you can have the co-signers with parents or whoever fill out the application as a co-applicant or just as an applicant or whatever you want to call it on the Tenant Cloud platform, and you can do a screening just like you would with the tenant. When they submit the application through Tenant Cloud, they're still going to have to agree to the same terms and conditions that are outlined there as part of the screening process. So they're going to still meet all of the criteria needed for you to be able to do that screening if you're doing the entire process through Tenant Cloud. So if you have any questions about how exactly to go about doing that, don't hesitate to reach out to our support team. Our support team, you can call them. Our phone number is listed at the footer of our website. We also have our ticket system inside of our account. And of course, you can email support@tenantcloud.com. A lot of the people that answer the phone on our support team are actually people who have extensive property management experience and much like myself. So you're going to get hopefully some really good answers when you reach out to the support team to get a better understanding of how to do that in the Tenant Cloud system. Is the screening for Canada as well as the USA? So the screening is for US based applicants. I am not sure. I think we're working on a one for Canada. We do have a ton of users in Canada, but of course that's a whole different ballgame compared to criteria and laws in the United States. So as of today, we do not have something that screens for Canada. It is US based screenings. What are some good ways to screen an individual who has never rented before but has always been a homeowner? That's a great question. I don't know that you would necessarily stray from the normal process. I mean, you would do the credit screening through Tenant Cloud, which would, of course, show their mortgage payment, excuse me, their mortgage payment history. For me personally, if I were looking at somebody like that, and I've had plenty of people like that over the years that have applied, if the mortgage payment history is rock solid, and you would of course look at the amount that they were paying for mortgage, was it 1,200, 1,500, 2,000? How does it relate to the amount that they'd be paying at your rental property? Then that would give you a good gauge of whether or not they would continue to be that reliable with payments at your rental property. Now, if their mortgage payment was only $1,000 and your rental is 2,000, well, now you're going to need to look at the greater picture of, has their income changed? Have their other bills changed over the course of time on their credit history? And has anything gone downhill on their credit report and the like? So again, this is all based on your criteria and what you're even allowed to take into consideration in your area. But those are just some of my initial thoughts, and based on some of the things that I've looked at in the past for applications for people who have just come from like a long-term mortgage or something, or maybe it's just somebody who's 18 or 19 and they've never rented in their lives before. you kind of have to look at other criteria because you can't go based off of rental history anymore. You have to go based off of other factors. And again, that boils back down to having a rental criteria that really details the various aspects of what you take into consideration. And so you really need to think about that when you're creating that rental criteria, all the different scenarios that you're going to come across, such as somebody who's in a mortgage, somebody who's never had a rental before, or somebody who's never even had a credit history before. Maybe they have nothing on their credit. Maybe they just turned 18 and there's zero information on their credit score. Well, now you're going to have to rely on more so on the factors such as income and their ability to pay a security deposit. And are you going to charge somebody a larger security deposit because they don't have a rental history and they don't have a credit history and the like? And what is that security deposit going to be across the board? Because what you approve for one person, the criteria you set for one person, you have to set it for everybody, because otherwise you might be considered discriminating against people based on other factors. So whether that's intentional or not, and whether that was your intent to do or not as a part of that process, that's what a rental criteria helps avoid entirely, is even the misconception that you had some level of discrimination in your approval process. So that is a good question, and hopefully that information was helpful in answering. Accepting business income when a self-employed individual can only show income via Venmo or Cash App. I would, me personally, I would say that is probably you'd probably want to look at other factors, because if that's the only record they can show, then that's potentially a red flag for me, or at least a yellow flag. I would want to see, are they filing taxes, and what is their what is the income that they're reporting on the state level. And so I would typically, when we would do business approvals, because we've had commercial accounts over the years, you would need all of their business records to show, like, what are they reporting as income, revenue, expenses, etc. And there are specific forms. Some of them vary by name and title from state to state, but basically you're going to want a complete overview of their business records. And then you may even ask for actual bank account history as well. So maybe ask for their bank account, primary bank account for their business, to see what type of cash flow is coming in and out of there, and do they have anything in savings or the like. And I would also take other things into consideration personally. How long have they been in business? Is it an official business, an LLC, a sole proprietorship, or are they just kind of a fly-by-night operation that they could just skip downtown tomorrow and nobody would know the better, except for the people that they left hanging? So yeah, there's a lot of stuff that's going to go into that you're going to want to make sure you're doing a thorough screening, not just looking at, in my opinion anyway, at least just looking at a Venmo and a Cash App. I would not take that as the sole proof of criteria for somebody who's using business income. We house a lot of travelers, not just from the state that we'll be renting in. Just to clarify, does TazWorks allow national or local only? Yes, they allow national. So basically, what TazWorks is essentially going to do is going to look at, there's two different options you can select from. Screen the person for just the county that they're currently connected to as of today. Or option two, I believe, states something along the lines of the county they're currently connected to today and any county that they've lived in or been connected to previously. So it would essentially look at any county, potentially any county that that person has um, had a legal residence in at any point, based on the package that you select. So you'll see the descriptions and the information when you go through the screening process, but that's a brief overview of what how it works. It can be any county anywhere in the United States. How long does a full report from the TC screening tool take to come back? So, great question. The primary one comes back typically pretty quickly, unless they've lived in a lot of places like me. I've lived in a lot of places. And so, ones years ago when I was still renting apartments, the screening report actually took like a week and a half for it to come back, because I had so many states and addresses, and even overseas where I live, where it took forever for them to get records for the past however many years of my life. So, but assuming somebody is relatively a standard individual who has average information coming back on their screening report that doesn't vary from the norm too much, it's typically pretty instantaneous for the primary screening report. Some people say it's instant in terms of minutes. Other people, it might be a day. But when you do the local county, that could extend it further. If you do the local county search, that could take more than instantaneous. It could come back immediately if there's no red flags that come up in their system that say, hey, wait, we need to double check this information on the county level. That information could still come back instantaneous as well. Just it's a little less likely that that will be the case if you're adding on local county searches. Does TC have a widget or add-in app for Wix? We do not. However, if you're looking for ways to integrate the Tenant Cloud system into your own website, definitely reach out to support. There's some very simple ways that most people do it, just adding buttons with links to different pages on the Tenant Cloud platform, like the login page or listings page, etc. If you're not sure what that means or how to do that, definitely don't hesitate to reach out to support. Our team would be happy to help you answer that question from a more how-to perspective. A little off topic, but will TC be adding a move-in condition report function? Yes, I'm so glad you asked. We're actually working on that right now. They actually recently asked me to jump in and start to help do some editing on the tool in terms of verbiage used throughout the documents and the pages and the processes of going through that. So if they've brought me in, that means that it is in the not too distant future for a release date. So I don't know the exact date, but yes, it is coming. It will be here shortly. They're just going through the initial build and beta phase, and then it'll be released site-wide. They will most certainly send out a system-wide communication to everybody, probably a notice in your account, as well as we'll probably send out an email once it's officially launched. And it's important when a new feature is launched in Tenant Cloud, we make decisions and improvements and changes based on user feedback. So when that tool does get released, please, please, please test it out, check it out, give us your feedback, tell us how you feel like it was designed, and if there's any changes that you would make, any improvements that you'd recommend, things that you think are missing. Our product team is going to rely heavily on feedback from users. So please take the time to do that once we do release it. You would indicated that you would discuss application criteria in more depth. We did go over a lot of that in depth. It was, I think, on like the fourth or fifth slide. I'm not sure which one it was, but it dove into the 5, I believe, different sections of the rental criteria process, things that you need to take into consideration during the rental screening process as part of your criteria. Things like credit scores versus rental scores, things like how far you go back in your screenings based on your state and local laws and federal laws, what information you're going to approve, whether it is just based off of felonies, or if you're also going to include misdemeanors, considering 1 in every 4 Americans has a criminal record, either misdemeanor or a felony, or at least a charge against them on the criminal level. And setting those criteria, and then income, and making sure that you go through and look at what is my income requirement going to be, and are there going to be variations if they do not have the income, but maybe they have a savings or a checking account with 20 or 30 or 50 or $100,000 in it. Can I accept that in lieu of this income requirement? And so I think we did dive into that pretty in depth. There are things that we can't go too specific because, again, it's going to vary based on your state and location. Because even individual cities actually have restrictions against what you can take into consideration. So it's important to really understand your local laws, but hopefully we provided a in-depth overview of the things that you should at least consider when you're going through that process of creating a rental criteria. My current criteria: effective 1/1/23, minimum credit score 650, rent cannot exceed 30% of income. Example of rent is 1,000 per month. No evictions, no collections. So um, again, that's going to vary based on each person's location and what they're allowed to do and aren't allowed to do and take into consideration and not take into consideration. But in general, we don't typically recommend using a credit score using the Vantage or FICO credit scoring models, because those, again, are not designed for renters. We advise using Renter Score, which is a tool and feature as a part of the Tenant Cloud screening products and other products out there, not just Tenant Cloud, but we recommend you use an actual tenant screening tool rather than a FICO score, which is based more off of loans and credit cards and insurance and their likelihood to pay those things. Those are typically not the same determinations of whether somebody's going to pay rent or not. How do you screen for those older applicants that do nothing online? What sources would you recommend? You can still screen them on Tenant Cloud. You can actually just have them fill out a paper application, and they can fill it out, and then you can manually enter it into the Tenant Cloud system. If they need assistance with like opening their email address to click a link or something just to approve something that maybe the screening tool sends them where they have to authorize a particular aspect of the screening or whatever, then I would certainly recommend doing that. But it helps you protect you against um, a lot of the risks that come with screening somebody without their consent, beyond just having their signature on a paper, by also getting their e-signature as well at some point in the process to fulfill FCRA requirements. So, but you can still very much screen manual applications online. In fact, we just introduced a new screening flow on Tenant Cloud recently. If you're not familiar with it, definitely don't hesitate to reach out to our support team. You can do manual applications now through the Tenant Cloud system. They don't have to log into their account, create an account, and do the screening and so on and so on. You can just do it all through your end on the Tenant Cloud system. Let's see. Can you answer the very first question in this Q&A? You skipped it. What are some effective choices to screen international tenants? Example, somebody who's moved from overseas. So you're typically not going to be able to pull overseas records, not through U.S. screening based products anyway. That is, if you want their records from overseas, then you'll typically have to use a tool that specifically pulls that data. And a lot of your US tenant screening tools simply don't pull that data. Um, I'm sure there's a whole web of reasons why they don't. It's already complicated enough for them to meet the requirements based on all the US laws and the variances between the different states and cities that they have to meet. In fact, I think TransUnion or Equifax or somebody recently was even just sued over not abiding by some laws that they were required to in the reporting aspects of reports. So, and they had to make a bunch of changes. So, you're simply not going to get that information through most screening tools online. If you have a lot of international applicants that you want to get their information from a country overseas somewhere, you would want to look for a tool that specifically does that. In terms of on Tenant Cloud, though, you can still do screenings of international applicants. It's just not going to pull data from overseas. It's only going to pull any data that's been relevant to them from the time that they arrived on US shores. If you're not sure how to do that, again, feel free to reach out to our support team. They're more than happy to help you with any international applicants you have that you're trying to get a screening completed. Thank you for the information. Will this presentation be available for replay? It's going to be uploaded to our Tenant Cloud YouTube channel, which it probably won't be today, but definitely within the next couple of business days. It will certainly be available to view on our Tenant Cloud YouTube channel in its entirety. And so we definitely encourage you to go and check that out and share it with anybody that you feel like on your team, or any business partners, anything that might need to have access to this information. Is there an online training available on the full course? That's a fantastic question. We are creating a lot of content around tenant screenings. We just started a couple months ago. We had a lot of content already, but we've really started to update it over the past 30 to 45 days, largely through our blog and then somewhat through our Tenant Cloud YouTube channel. We're starting to put some videos together, but you'll find a ton of information on tenant screenings in our Tenant Cloud blog. We've written a ton about the topic, and we're actually going to be publishing quite a few more articles over the next few weeks about the topic as well. So if you aren't already subscribed to our Tenant Cloud newsletter, definitely go to tenantcloud.com/blog and subscribe to the newsletter, and you'll get updates when we publish new information about topics such as this. In terms of an actual online training course, we do not have an actual online training course as it relates to something like Tenant Cloud screenings, but that is a great idea, and I will certainly pass that on to our team to see if we have capacity for something like that, if that's something that people would find beneficial. There is also, by the way, let's see, a poll. If you could click on that button on the left side of the screen or right side of the screen, it's a little poll button. If you have a minute to answer that, let's see here. I believe it's published. If you can go ahead and select an emoji, if you can see that little poll on the left hand side, there should be a poll there, should be open for voting. If you would do me a huge favor and just provide us any feedback about this presentation and just Did you find the information helpful? Have you used tenant screenings before through Tenant Cloud and the like? That would be fantastic. We'd love to get your feedback on that information. So definitely, let's see here. Let's see. I keep seeing in the chat that social security numbers are not included in the tenant screening tool. Is that correct? And what's the reason behind it? The tenant does actually end up providing their social security number, but we do it in a way that's encrypted that protects both Tenant Cloud and you as a property manager from not having that information and potentially in an unsecure way. And so it's just an added layer of protection. What we do recommend is that if you need the social security number, because I believe some states out there, not all of them, some of them require or at least ask for the social security number as part of like the eviction process. We recommend doing that as a part of the move in process and requesting that they provide you all of their up to date personal information and any other information you need that maybe you didn't get in the screening process, including a copy of their driver's license, because a lot of states you actually can't even ask for their driver's license, or it's recommended not to because it is one of those added layers of potential discrimination, whether you intend to or not. So, for example, if you're doing a rental application and you're asking everybody to provide you with their and you're asking everybody to provide you with their driver's licenses and you're approving and declining all these people, but let's say the amount of people that you end up approving is 90%, let's just say people who are white people or whatever. And then you have a ton of applications you declined and they're minorities and it's Hispanic or they're black or whatever. Then it gives the impression that because you were accepting the driver's licenses as part of the screening process, that you were intentionally discriminating against this group of people. And so a lot of property management companies actually don't even ask for the driver's license until the person has been approved or declined. And then they ask for a copy of the driver's license, which then, of course, shows their face and their height and their hair color and eye color and all that other stuff. And so that's just an added part of what we recommend, just including in your move in process, is getting that type of information when they move in as part of the move in documentation. Hey, before we give you keys, we need your social security number. We need your copy of your driver's license. We need this. We need this. We need this. And then you hand them the keys once that information is provided. So, but they do absolutely provide their social security number as part of the screening process. Will TenantCloud have state specific help for landlords, forms, rules, laws, etc.? Yeah, we're actually working. If you go to the tenantcloud.com/blog, and you go to the laws tab on there on the blog thing, it'll actually pull up a map of all the different states. We're actually working on creating all of that content for all 50 states. A lot of people are already finding the information we've provided in the states we've done already extremely helpful. So just keep an eye out for that. It's not, we don't have all 50 states done yet. We're trying to be very thorough in the process and provide the best information to our users as much as possible. And again, in those articles, we link to the official sources. So we'll link out to like the California.gov website about laws about the things that we're talking about. So it's always important to go back to the source, of course, but we try to summarize and give overviews of the most important aspects of things like you talked about, like forms, rules, laws, etc., in those articles to really help give you as much information as possible. All right, I think that has wrapped up this presentation here. Let's see. Yeah, a resident score in Tenant Cloud is different than a credit score. It's going to bring you to a TransUnion credit report because, of course, you have to pull credit reports from one of the various credit bureaus because they're the ones that have all of that information to begin with on the national level. But in terms of the credit score and resident score, those are two different things. So we use a resident scoring model, not so much a credit scoring model. So if you have any questions about more details on that, don't hesitate to reach out to our support team. They're certainly happy to explain the differences and how to interpret and read the reports that you're seeing come through the Tenant Cloud screening tool, as well as the local county screening report as well. So again, thank you for attending this presentation. Again, hopefully the information was valuable and wasn't a massive waste of your time. And hopefully you learned something that will help you improve your screening process, and definitely encourage you to streamline the application and screening process through the Tenant Cloud system and use the various tools that we've incorporated, both the national database screening, the local county screening, and the income insights, because all combined together, they are a very powerful tool that helps you combat against a lot of the things that landlords and property managers are battling today when it comes to things like fraud and incomplete information and not getting a complete picture of, is this person actually going to be a quality renter? And it's going to set you head and shoulders above other landlords out there and property management companies that are strictly going based off of something as simple as a credit score that's not even designed to determine whether they're going to be a good tenant in the first place. So again, thanks for joining, and we'll look forward to seeing you on the Tenant Cloud platform.